Welcome to this week's podcast by Step Kids Nutrition, where we explore matters related to pediatric nutrition with an invited guest. My name is Professor Rosan Meyer. I'm a specialist pediatric dietitian with almost 30 years of experience in pediatric nutrition. In each podcast episode, we will dive into the science and also practical tips behind topics related to childhood nutrition with an invited specialist. Whether you're a healthcare professional, a parent, or just interested in pediatric nutrition, you're at the right place. I'm absolutely delighted this week on our Step by Step Kids Nutrition podcast to invite a very good friend and also colleague, Professor Yvan Vandenplas. And we discussed beforehand how I'm going to introduce you because actually your biography is very long. So I'm going to read off because it's so impressive. You are, of course, paediatric gastroenterologist and from Brussels in Belgium. You have an extensive career in pediatric gastroenterology, and I remember looking up to you at conferences and saying, gosh, I would love to collaborate with you at some point in future. But you were head of the department of pediatric gastroenterology and nutrition already in 1987, if I've got that right, at the University Hospital, and you're the founder of KidzHealth Castle at this hospital as well. Then I think you've authored, we've spoken about that now, more than 600 PubMed articles for anybody working in academia. That's a huge achievement. And I think you've presented more than 1,000 times at different international congresses. Yvan, and most importantly for our topic today, you are particularly interested in disorders of gut-brain interaction, like, for example, colic, gastroesophageal reflux, constipation, but also cow's milk allergy and the management of that. So that is our topic today, this overlap between colic and cow's milk allergy, which I've been so privileged to co-author with you recently.
Thank you.
Yvan,
very nice introduction, Rosan.
It's a big pleasure. It's an honor to have you. So I'm going to launch into it. And my first question to you is, I know that the Rome 5 criteria has changed and colic is now named something different. Would you mind sharing with the audience what this new name is for colic?
Yeah, well, the authors of the Rome 5 criteria changed colic to infant distress syndrome. Personally, I think this may be not the best other option because distress suggests more anxiety for parents maybe. On the other side, colic refers to colon, and we don't really know that infants do cry a lot because of something happening in their colon all the time. So personally, I think that excessive crying would be a good terminology to describe infants who cry more or who cry enough to make parents anxious, so anxious that they seek medical help. So there is normal crying and there is excessive crying. And I personally think that for the broad public, excessive crying is a better terminology than...
Yeah, and as an interesting side fact, I was in Brazil recently and we had a colleague of ours from Italy, and apparently distress does not translate very well in Portuguese and Italian, so there's also that language barrier. But I think the thinking behind it most probably was a good thinking, as you said, from a physiological perspective, and it's trying also to give recognition to what parents are feeling when a child excessively cries.
That's true, absolutely.
So I know the objective is to talk about this overlap and between cow's milk allergy and colic and when to consider one versus the other. But I want to start with colic. What are the symptoms? Because you've already spoken about excessive crying, but what are, if you say, what are the symptoms? When does it typically occur in terms of age?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. And colic starts very early in life, which means within the first 2-3 weeks. But it disappears also around the age of 4 to 5 months, so that excessive crying is mainly something from the age of between 2 weeks and 4 to 5 months. Why it disappears at 4 to 5 months? Very luckily for the parents, very luckily for the infants, but in fact no one has a real clue why that crying disappears around that age. And another issue is that it's of course very subjective. Unfortunately, there is no real good objective measure or tool to measure the duration of crying. Up to now, there has been no tool that objectively separates when the reason for crying, so crying because the child is hungry, crying because of whatever reason. So we cannot do that. So it depends on subjective reporting of the parents, and therefore it's also important to have knowledge about normal crying time. And together with you and people from the COMIS group, the symptom score for awareness of cow's milk allergy, we collected data on almost 3,000 presumed healthy infants worldwide, and just got a paper accepted on the percentile curves of normal crying. And it appears that the percentile 50 is 0, which means that the vast majority of the infants luckily do cry very, very limited time, but the percentile 90 is around 2.5 to 3 hours a day. So up to 3 hours a day of crying is still what's happening in presumed healthy infants, and it's important for healthcare professionals to communicate that to parents, to reassure them that many infants unfortunately do cry a lot, but that they are for the rest healthy.
Yeah. And I think for the listeners, what we'll make sure is when we speak during this text, we'll upload the article also and make sure that they've got the reference. There were two very important nuggets of information that you've said there, which I'll kind of build on. The first one is the age that you would expect generally with excessive crying or infant distress syndrome, that it kind of disappears 4 to 5 months of age. And I think the other one is that the normality of it. So as well.
And that's about 20% of the infants present with the old definition of colic, which is about 3 hours a day of crying during 3 days a week during 2-3 weeks. So 20% of the infants, it's quite a huge population of the infants that present with that crying a lot.
Yes, absolutely. And I can imagine at this point, because we will talk about cow's milk allergy, and I want to kind of talk about how do you manage colic? So let's just keep colic, excessive crying, or, infant distress syndrome, what you want. But if somebody comes to you and you kind of going, gosh, taking a history, this is excessive crying, what are the management options here?
So the first thing to do for a healthcare professional is to look for alarm symptoms, to see if the baby is thriving very well, to see if there is severe atopic dermatitis, if there is more than normal regurgitation, whatever, because that might indicate that there is another problem than just the excessive crying. But in the absence of other major symptoms, and when the focus is on excessive crying, the first thing to do for the healthcare professional is just explain to the parents about the crying behavior of infants. It's their only way of communication they have. And so explain that it happens a lot in a lot of babies and that it goes over time, and just try to give them better understanding that this is really a difficult period in the quality of life of their infant and for them, but that there is no disease and that there is no reason to be anxious. And if the parents are again trustful and think, well, okay, this is unpleasant, but it will go over and I'm not stressed anymore, that itself has also a positive impact on that behavior of the child, because there is a continuous communication between parents and the child, and so stress of the father or mother, that's felt by the baby. So reassurance, and for the rest, there are not really, I think, evidence-based intervention which show a lot of benefit. Maybe some probiotics in breastfed infants have been suggested. The evidence for formula-fed infants is relatively low. So you can try a lot of things, but I think the inconvenience of those interventions which are not evidence-based, which are often not really helpful, then may make the parents even more anxious because you as a healthcare professional recommended something which has no impact, and that will then reinforce the parents in their thinking that their child really has a health issue, which most of the time, in 90% or 95% of those babies, is not the case. A lot of those infants get changed to formula. Some of those infants also may have, for instance, cow's milk allergy, because that's another topic we have to discuss. But crying alone is only exceptional reason to think about cow's milk allergy. Most of the time, that those infants will also present with other manifestations. And in fact, the fact that colic or excessive crying disappears at around 4 months, I think the best way is try to gain time to wait until 4 months. And if then there is no improvement, then it's also not a natural history of that excessive crying. And then you have to look certainly for other conditions and look on how to manage that. But so I think in the absence of other manifestations, the best approach is change nothing.
And listen.
Yes, absolutely.
So you've really created a nice kind of move to our next question, which is really around this confusion with the overlap between cow's milk allergy, colic/excessive crying. And prior to today's podcast, you sent me a lovely article, and you've already hinted to it, which looked at and found that 10% of children, 1 in 10 more or less, where there's excessive crying, you have cow's milk allergy. But out of that cohort, I think it was something like 35 or 38% had been on an elimination diet for cow's milk. So I want to first start off, why is this confusion between when is it cow's milk allergy and when is it infant distress syndrome or colic?
Well, the one who has a clear answer to that, he will certainly get a Nobel Prize, because it's certainly difficult and overlapping and very confusing, because we explained that colic itself is always very subjective because no way to objectivate it. And we also lack clear diagnostic criteria for cow's milk allergy. You can suspect it, but then even for positive specific IgE, we know that that can be falsely positive. There is also non-IgE mediated, and the best way how to diagnose it is elimination diet and then reintroduce the oral food challenge, but that a lot of parents refuse because it will make the child develop symptoms again. So, and if it's a non-IgE mediated allergy and you need 2-3 days for the symptoms to develop, even your oral food challenge will be very difficult to interpret. So it's certainly both conditions are not easy to diagnose. Moreover, studies have also shown that for excessive crying, whatever you do as intervention, you have a placebo effect of up to 25-30% just because you bring reassurance. So even a positive response is no proof of the condition. So it's certainly not easy at all to...
I think, Yvan, you've highlighted the difficulties, but I think there are already some nuggets of information in the history. You've highlighted already age is a very important factor to consider. And I suppose you also highlighted the multitude of other symptoms that you might have, because you might have a child, for example, where there's only excessive crying and they're growing well. But I'm assuming also that thinking about the symptoms and when you might more consider is if, for example, you've got excessive crying and you've got a child that's regurgitating and possibly having diarrhea with eczema. So is the key therefore, because if we don't have tests in the history,
Yeah, of course, history is important. The risk to develop allergic disease is higher in families with atopic disease. So there is certainly a genetic factor, we know that. And then I think is risk or chance calculation, because colic is 20% of the infants, atopic dermatitis is 20% of the infants, excessive regurgitation is 20% of the infants. So when there is a combination of those symptoms, It still can be just by coincidence because they are so prevalent. On the other side, the more symptoms that are present, the more likely it becomes that there is a condition like allergy behind it. And if you have skin manifestations and gastrointestinal symptoms or skin and crying, then you need something behind which refers to the immune system. Because you have different organ systems which are involved, or is just by coincidence, which is certainly also possible. And we should not forget that whenever you do also you switch to therapeutic formulas, most of the time you do not only change the proteins, you also change carbohydrates, lactose to other carbohydrates, you add other biotics, so there are other factors which also may bring benefits. So even a positive response, yes, makes the diagnosis likely, but is certainly not a real evidence-based proof. So, as we said before, the one who finds the good, reliable diagnostic test for cow's milk allergy, it can have the Nobel Prize. And as long as we do not have that, it will be topics of confusion and discussion.
Yeah, and I think it is here worthwhile mentioning. I mean, we both are so aware of this concern around overdiagnosis. But I do want to say, I mean, yes, there's a lot of focus, but there's also, in my opinion, I get a lot of children where you go, my goodness, this is an underdiagnosis. It was not recognized with real consequences. And this elimination and reintroduction, I want to kind of not corner you, but I kind of just go a little bit further into that, because I know you've documented, and I almost want to say it was a randomized control trial where they signed consent to say they would be reintroducing. And I think was it 25% that they would not when it came to it.
Yes, absolutely. They refused. So that's just because parents are happy because finally their child is doing better. And even if they signed a contract, we agree to reintroduce, they say no way. So that highlights very clearly that in real life, many parents refuse to do that challenge test, and then those children are considered to be non-allergic because you did not prove they are allergic. But some of them would for sure have a positive challenge test, others probably not. But that means that we have also not a real proof, evidence-based number of how frequent cow's milk protein allergy is. Probably somewhere around 3 to 4%, that's what we estimate. But because of that lack of clear diagnosis, we miss that. On the other side, you were discussing about overdiagnosis, and I fully agree that depending on from country to country a little bit, to education of the healthcare professionals, there may be underdiagnosis, but there may be also overdiagnosis. On the other side, we just had now in Belgium an insurance company, national insurance company, who looked at percentage of infants under 1 year who got proton pump inhibitors prescribed, and that's 13%.
Wow.
So that's enormous high, and we know that proton pump inhibitors do have adverse effects on the microbiome. So it's 2 times bad to prescribe too much proton pump inhibitors or to prescribe too much treatments for cow's milk allergy. But on the other side, dietary interventions will have no adverse effects, and proton pump inhibitors do have adverse
A long-term adverse event effect.
If you do it wrong, I prefer the overdiagnosis and the dietary treatment because of the absence of adverse effects to the medication. And of course, the best way would be to do it correct and to diagnose the cow's milk protein allergy correctly. But as we said and we agree, it will be a challenge.
It is a challenge, and I think maybe just some clarifying points there. Of course, for IgE-mediated allergy, we've got a much better idea in terms of prevalence. It's really the question marks around non-IgE-mediated, and the Europreval study is a classic study where the Netherlands and the UK, we had UK certainly more than 50% were classified on challenge as non-IgE-mediated. Germany and I think Lithuania, they had zero non-IgE-mediated allergy, where I know that colleagues of ours have written back and saying that is not possible. So, which exactly as you're saying, that's clearly under-recognized there.
Yeah.
And it goes back to the distress. I mean, from a practical perspective, what I try now to do is, how can I say, as a dietitian, I'm a salesperson because I sell them to say, look, when we embark on this elimination diet, then I'm selling also not only the elimination, I'm selling also that we need to go through the full diagnostic process. That doesn't mean I'm having easier tasks than what you've got, but it is often this kind of preparation at some point the reintroduction needs to occur. Because it could be exactly at that age, and often for us, we say that looking at the data, that by 16 weeks they come to see a dietitian or a physician around cow's milk allergy, which is more or less the age when you're starting to see outgrowing the excessive crying.
Absolutely.
So that needs to be taken into account. So I kind of want to, on this is a nice point, because you have just highlighted that the person would get a Nobel Prize if they've got a diagnostic tool. But I wanted to ask, you mentioned at the beginning about the COMAS awareness tool, which I'm also part of. But I think for our listeners, explain this awareness raising and the evidence behind the tool itself.
Yeah, well, as you know, you are part of the group, and it's a group of key opinion leaders in the field who developed a score of different symptoms: regurgitation, duration of crying, stool consistency, skin manifestations, so urticaria, atopic eczema, angioedema, and also respiratory tract symptoms, and gave that a score. And by now, multiple trials have been done with this score, and there seems to be a cutoff of 10 or more, which seems to raise awareness about the possibility of cow's milk allergy being the cause of the combination of those symptoms. And a score below 6 seems to make that risk for cow's milk allergy almost zero. 10 or above is an awareness score that should tell the healthcare professional, think about that cow's milk allergy may be the cause of what's happening to that infant. But of course, it's not a real diagnostic tool, it's an awareness tool. Voluntary, we also did not include all symptoms. For instance, anaphylaxis is not part of that score. Blood in the stools is not part of that score, because there are also symptoms which might be the consequence of other mechanisms. Blood in the stools may be a severe infection which needs immediate intervention. So we would not like that a healthcare professional misses infectious disease for blood in the stools because it's part of that allergy score. So that's for the healthcare professionals. And what we also developed with the same group is the pre-COMIS, which is then the awareness tool for parents, if you want. So it's something that will be available on the net, which is more or less the same symptoms but without score, but helping parents to look at those symptoms, to evaluate them, to note, write down how frequent, how severe these symptoms are, and then go with that document to the healthcare professionals. Also to bring reassurance, because what we discussed before is we have those centile curves on regurgitation, on crying, on normal stool consistency, which are included on that information for the parents, so to bring also reassurance, so that we hope that by having a validated tool on the net, and parents go to look at the internet anyway, to have a tool that on the one side helps to bring them reassurance and not to go unnecessary to a healthcare professional. On the other side, if the tool does not reassure them or shows them that their infant scores above the centile 97, it gives them also a reason to consult a healthcare professional.
I think an important part that we do need to mention for the healthcare professionals listening is that the pre-COMIS does not have an actual score for the parents.
Yeah,
In.
absolutely.
So if it reaches the threshold of 10 and above, it will not give a score. It will just say, speak to your healthcare professional,
Yeah.
highlight that. And it gives a nice printout to go to the healthcare professional. So whilst we've used kind of like spitting up instead of regurgitation, so it actually corresponds exactly with the coma score.
Yeah, and
I,
I think, as I said, that the fact that we include in this information also the normality, the centile score, that it will help to bring reassurance to those parents, because they go to look on the net because they're anxious for the symptoms their child presents, and then they can also see, oh, that's what happens to more than half of the babies, so I don't have to be worried.
yeah, and I think we have highlighted the lack of objectivity, but at least with the COMAS tool, I find, because I use it to track the children. So if I make the decision to say, okay, you've scored above 10 and I'm going to now track you, I find it's quite an objective way in the same child to repeat it after I normally see them 4 to 6 weeks after. So I think that's quite a nice tool, and we'll make sure that the links for both, for the parents, the pre-comas and comas, because it's the same primary link. We are now kind of migrating to the management of cow's-milk allergy, but you've already mentioned, the difference. But just for our listeners in summary, how would the management of cow's milk allergy differ from how you manage colic in the traditional sense, excessive crying?
Yeah. Well, as we discussed, for excessive crying alone, it's just reassurance. Suspicion of cow's milk allergy means dietary treatment, means a therapeutic formula, either an extensive cow's milk based hydrolysate or a rice hydrolysate for the majority of the infants. Breastfed infants, if you suspect cow's milk allergy, you put the mother on a cow's milk free diet, and if there are very severe symptoms, severe faltering growth, anaphylaxis, it's amino acid based formula, but that's a very small group, of course. So the vast majority is mild to moderate symptoms in formula-fed babies, and then it's rice hydrolysate or cow's milk-based hydrolysate. And my personal opinion is that rice hydrolysate, when it's available, gives you much more clearer response because it's totally cow's milk free. So the advantage of the rice hydrolysate is, if there is no improvement, it's not cow's milk allergy because you took all cow's milk proteins away. With the extensive cow's milk based hydrolysate, it's traditionally has been the first choice because rice is in a lot of countries only there since very recently or is still not available. But you still have cow's milk peptides, and so when there is no response to the cow's milk based hydrolysate, it's always the question, was I wrong? Is it not cow's milk allergy, or is it cow's milk allergy, and does the child react to the extensive hydrolysate? So you make the life much more easy if you take all cow's milk out of the diet of that infant. And now, since a couple of years, we have the possibility to do that. Historically, we had nothing else than the cow's milk based hydrolysate, but since other kind of formulas become available, that option seems more logic to me, at least for the diagnostic elimination diet.
And then one can make a decision. Yvan, we're coming to the end, and I feel we've had an extensive discussion, but is there anything that you feel related to this overlap and this confusion between cow's milk allergy and colic excessive crying that you feel we've not covered, that you'd like to kind of just mention at the end?
I think we covered most of the topics.
I think so too. Then I'm going to take the opportunity to say thank you so much. Really appreciate making the time and also being able to tap in your extensive knowledge on this topic.
Pleasure. It was nice to see you and to talk to you.
Thank you for listening or watching this week's podcast. You can follow me on various social media platforms, which we'll share on the screen, or you can visit my website at rosanpaediatricdietitian.com. You can also like this podcast on our Step by Step Kids Nutrition YouTube channel. Thank you very much.